You know by now that we're all about the journey. June's journey, that is. I feel this game was made for us specifically. It's the closest I've come to feeling like I've been dropped in the middle of a mystery novel set in the 1920s.
That's because you get to play as June, a globe-trotting flapper/amateur sleuth who lives to solve mysteries. You get to visit all sorts of fascinating places, from Paris to Cuba. You beat levels by identifying hidden objects in the scene. And we found that the more we play, the sharper our observational skills become.
The game is delightful, and a wonderful way to relax. I'll often pull my phone out and play it when I've got a free moment, like I'm on hold with an archive, or I'm waiting for a courthouse to open up in the morning. I'm currently on Chapter 16, meaning I'm searching for the son of June's housekeeper, who's on the run from New Orleans gamblers and the police. It's a wild time.
We know our audience is filled with folks who love a good mystery. Now is your chance to try your hand at being a sleuth yourself. Discover your inner detective when you download June's Journey for free today on iOS and Android. So we often begin our episodes with a bit of a content warning to let people know we may be covering some material that may be disturbing to some. I think for this particular episode, it makes sense to have maybe an extra content warning to make things extra clear. This episode is about the sentencing hearing of Kegan Kline, and it goes into some details about child sexual abuse that maybe some of you would find pretty disturbing.
Yes, so please be cautious. So please keep that in mind as you're listening, and we'll try to flag before we talk about really extra disturbing stuff.
And we are recording this episode after a very long day in court and driving. So we apologize if we're a bit loopier than normal.
So today was the day that Kegan Kline received his prison sentence for a slew of 25 counts of essentially crimes related to child sexual abuse materials.
And you've probably seen the headlines, and you know that he was sentenced to 43 years with 3 years suspended. But what you might not know is the story of how it got to that place. And I'd like to begin by offering special words of praise to the prosecutors of Miami County, Indiana. This office is led by Jeffrey Sinkovics, and the prosecutors who worked on this case were Courtney Alwine and Jennifer Keifer. They made the choice to really go into more detail than you often see in a sentencing hearing. I think when we found out that Kegan Kline had pled guilty, there was some concern that, well, now, since there's not going to be a trial, we're not going to really find out the details of what he did. And the prosecutors made the decision to basically tell us some of that stuff, and they told us today.
So we're going to take you through the entire day from our perspective. We'll try to contextualize what we need to contextualize, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. But some things we'll probably need to do a bit of more research on ourselves before we really weigh in on them. So keep that in mind, and we hope that you enjoy this recounting of Kegan Kline's sentencing hearing. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases. We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is the Delphi murders, Kegan Kline's sentencing hearing.
So the sentencing hearing actually got underway, I think, around 9:40 a.m. in Judge Spahr's court in Miami County, Indiana. And one thing that struck me really early on was Judge Spahr mentioned the pre-sentence report of Kegan Kline. A pre-sentence report is, of course, a report prepared by the probation department, I believe, that basically goes into all the details you'd want to know about someone before sentencing him. You know, what is this person's background? What are the crimes? Has there been remorse? Do we think he might offend again? And he mentioned that this pre-sentence report was 720 pages.
Yes. So that's going to be a long report. And we're going to hear more about that when it comes to the probation officer who testified. But I think it's worth stating that, you know, this whole situation was a somewhat unusual sentencing hearing. Talking to other reporters gathered there, it's not often that you have prosecutors and defense make arguments to this extent and like have witnesses on.
And that's why I was saying earlier, I really appreciate Miami County for putting witnesses on the stand to give us all some more information and more context about what exactly Kegan Kline did.
And we really wanted to know more about this. And I think we were heartened by the fact that Judge Timothy Spahr, who of course is the judge here, blocked off basically after a few 8:30 hearings, blocked off the rest of the day for the hearing. So I think we all knew we were in for a long haul. We didn't quite know how long it would be. We got there. We woke up at like 6 a.m. We got there, like 8:30?
About 8:10.
8:10. And so we were hanging around for a long while. So that's to give you a better sense of why we sound so loopy. But there were some recesses in between, but it ended up kind of closing out pretty late.
So the first witness was called by the prosecution. The questioning of this witness was done by Jennifer Keifer. This witness was Commander Christopher Cecil of the Indiana State Police. This gentleman oversees the Internet Crimes Against Children Unit.
Or ICAC. ICAC refers to the different police entities that essentially investigate instances of child sexual abuse materials. So they're very important. We've talked about them before. We've actually interviewed some ICAC cops.
Particularly Internet Crimes Against Children. Internet
Crimes Against Children. We interviewed the Catfish cops in a previous episode, and that's sort of what they do. And so this is a man who has built up a career of expertise in that particular disturbing field, and he knows how to run these investigations.
And I want to say, as I mentioned, Prosecutor Jennifer Keifer handled this questioning. She did a great job leading him through some very complicated testimony. And I really think this was an outstanding witness. And I think the Indiana State Police, frankly, would be well served by having this gentleman or people he works with give interviews and inform the public. Because often when we hear about law enforcement, we hear about mistakes and stuff they make. And this gentleman is clearly doing really high quality work and very important work.
And so, and what makes him an effective witness? Well, I would say he had a very calm, engaging manner. I felt he was able to describe some very disturbing and also complicated facets of a child sexual abuse materials investigation in a way that was very easily understandable and just sort of walking us through his process as it pertains to the investigation into Kegan Kline. And through his description of that, we actually got to know a few things that may interest our listeners who are looking for information about how does this all tie into Delphi potentially. Before we continue with that, I want to note that the crimes themselves here are so important on their own. You're not going to have a lot of crossover here. The prosecution's not going to be referencing Delphi. This case is not the Delphi murders case. This is a case important unto itself about child sexual abuse materials. So, in fact, for a long time, they basically would discuss when Delphi came up, it would come up as another case. They wouldn't even name it because, again, that's not the focus here. That's not what they're supposed to be doing. They're not supposed to be trying to convict Kegan based on his connection to Delphi. They're trying to give a sense of what his crimes that he's convicted of were.
Exactly. And Commander Cecil talked about his work. The ICAC unit does about 2,500 investigations a year. They do forensic examinations of phones and other devices. And these forensic examinations allow them to extract data, including passwords for different internet accounts, especially like social media accounts, but even bank accounts. It allows them to get text messages. It allows them sometimes to get browser history. There's a lot of things they can find out about you when they do one of these forensic examinations.
And he also went into a bit about how a forensic examination typically works and how it also worked in Kegan Kline's case. Let's go back to February 25th, 2017. Kegan Kline's name has come up in the Delphi murders investigation. His house is raided by FBI and ISP. Basically what happens is some sort of like forensic examination bus unit pulls up. A triage station within there is going through the phones seized in that raid. And Kegan and his father, Tony Kline, are being interviewed in that bus, essentially. This is all happening. And basically, now, Cecil's not involved at this point.
Cecil's not involved in this point. We'll get to that in a minute. At this point, they are doing some sort of examination of the devices, but it's a relatively superficial and quick examination. And they do some basic questioning. And then after that, these devices are seized. And then basically, we have this gap that we talk about because, of course, the search happened in 2017. Kegan Kline is not arrested until 2020. And we hear this gap talked about a lot today, and we'll certainly hear more about it in this episode. So then basically, Cecil doesn't become involved until 2020. And we find out later who asked him to get involved. But the thing to remember now is he doesn't get involved until 2020. And in 2020, he's asked to do a forensic examination of Kegan Kline's devices. And he does so, and it takes him a few months to do.
Yes. He says that he believes in total he examined 7 devices from Kegan Kline, specifically an iPhone 4, an iPhone 3G, Samsung Galaxy S4 and S5, something called a netbook, an iPod Touch 2, and an iPhone 5C. So that's what he's looking at. And he's getting information off of each of them. But he's stresses in this back and forth with Miss Keifer that he didn't get everything. In particular, with one of the iPhones, Kegan was able to hide it, essentially. Or at least he says he forgot about it and he just turned it in on his own volition. But police say he hid it and obstructed justice by deleting multiple apps before turning it into state police on the 27th.
And basically, Kegan Kline admitted that because he pled guilty to the charges of obstructing justice.
Yes. So
let's talk about some of the things he found.
Yeah.
We've heard about this Emily Ann profile. We found out today that there were several profiles associated with Emily. They were like profiles called Emily Porter, Emily Parker, Emily is ugly. Can you tell us some more about these Emily profiles?
Basically, Cecil was able to describe the persona that all of these different Emily profiles fell into. Kegan is essentially pretending to be, and this is incredibly disturbing, so I just will note that, a preteen girl who is very insecure about her appearance and is constantly looking for validation around that. She's bisexual and experimenting with her sexuality, but also very naive. And basically, he's using images that Cecil described as real images of a real girl that Kegan must have gotten through some means that we don't know about, that to basically lure in other girls to sending pictures, lewd images to him. But they think they're talking to another preteen girl. They're not. And it's just, this Emily, he crafts as a tragic figure. Emily is, saying things like she cuts herself. She's on heroin. She watched her family die when a semi crashed into them and they all burned to death. She's homeless. She's having to turn to sex work to survive. Just a lot of very disturbing things. And yeah.
And let me say, It's easy when we hear these things in the context of these were stories Kegan Kline told. It's easy for us to say these are ridiculous stories that no one should believe. But keep in mind that Kegan Kline was targeting naive girls.
Preteen girls.
Who had no reason to disbelieve him. Girls who perhaps weren't aware that people lie like this.
Or girls in some cases, as he described, that were going through things in their own life that may have made them extra sympathetic to another girl their age going through other hardships. And he's also not necessarily dumping all these facts on each girl at once. It's just, this is the general persona he's constructing. He's using things to get sympathy. Yeah. And manipulate others in order to do what he wants.
And of course, Emily has a brother, Kegan, who sometimes is introduced to these girls. And Emily has a father, Adam, who also is often introduced to these girls, and sometimes in a pretty lewd manner, as I'm sure we will be discussing.
And so Adam, I should note, is actually photos were stolen from a Daily Mirror article to portray the Adam character. So he's using specific photos with that, just as he is with Emily Ann, whereas Kegan's supposed to be himself. Emily describes Kegan as her stepbrother. And I should note that with the Emily Ann, there's a Snapchat associated with it, an Apple ID, a Kik, a Microsoft for Skype, a what used to be My Yearbook, but is now known as Meet Me, a Meet Me account. So he's all over these phones with this Emily Ann stuff.
And he would sometimes be Kegan to them. And as Kegan, sometimes he would offer them money or drugs to get what he wanted, which was pictures. He would also have Emily Ann, say, why don't you talk to my brother? Would you like to have sex with me and my father as a threesome? This is one of many explicit things we're going to mention here. Kegan would talk about wanting to have sex with these girls in these texts, and he'd want to get pictures of their vaginas and buttholes.
Yeah. It's just absolutely disgusting. This was a really hard hearing to sit through, guys, because it was just thing after thing of just utter just nightmare stuff. It's just awful.
And Commander Cecil said that these chats of this nature go back to 2011, and they numbered approximately 4,000 to 5,000 chats. And also there were thousands and thousands of images they were able to get off his phone from forensic examinations. And because a lot of these pictures were close-ups of specific body parts, we'll leave that to your imagination, it can be difficult to determine if this particular image is CSAM or not.
Yes, because you might have trouble identifying the developmental stage of a child if you don't have any other context or you can't identify them. You can't necessarily say that this is a 15 or 16-year-old versus an 18-year-old. You just can't. And if you can't say that, even if you're pretty sure that this very well could be CSAM, you cannot charge anybody with that crime because that's not how the law works. You have to have evidence.
And he also said some of these images were what he described as child erotica. And child erotica is apparently pictures of kids in suggestive or provocative poses, or at least poses that a pedophile might find suggestive or provocative. But in these poses, they are clothed. And he said this is a red flag, but it is of itself not illegal. And he described it rather memorably, and perhaps in a way that some of you might find disturbing. He described it as gratifying yourself over a Walmart circular.
Yeah. And talked about how basically pedophiles will sometimes clip out pictures of kids in bathing suits and do this stuff with. And again, huge red flag. They can't prosecute that. I have to commend the people who work in ICAC in that space, because the sheer amount of just utter nightmarish stuff you have to wade through every day must just be, you have to be a very strong person to deal with that.
Yeah, I can't imagine. There were lots of screenshots, he said, from Snapchat, lots of pictures of abdomens.
Yeah, that was actually something he said that Emily Ann would do in particular. She would often, or I say she, it's Kegan. Kegan would start by sending a picture of, quote, Emily Ann's abdomen, kind of, and basically one thing they noted, this goes through all of Kegan's text, but they started here with Emily Ann. He is immediately essentially getting lewd, asking for sexual pictures. Like, it's not necessarily a slow process. Like, he's kind of bombarding these girls, his victims, with kind of like, send me this quickly, and basically that's the MO here.
Yes. He also discussed how these images on phones, as I'm sure many of you know, the pictures we take with our devices have a lot of metadata. It might tell exactly like what day and time the picture was taken, and it could also show where the picture was taken and when the picture was acquired by a user. And so all of this stuff was helpful in the investigation, because a lot of the sentencing decisions ended up turning on, were these particular counts single episodes of crimes, or were several counts one episode? And so one way of determining that was, well, when were different pictures acquired?
I want to note one thing that was interesting about Commander Cecil's testimony is he indicated that not all of the victims that they were able to identify were located in Indiana. Later on through testimony, we found out that actually the majority of victims that were identified were in Indiana within a drive's distance, essentially. But there were also others, Virginia, Illinois, Kentucky, Connecticut, Wisconsin got thrown out. So one thing that the prosecutors kept stressing was the incredible reach of Kegan Kline, how he was able, the sheer volume of communications and child sexual abuse materials and his reach to kind of be luring in these young girls was something to behold, according to them, because this is not a small case. This is a sprawling case.
And he mentioned that Kegan Kline acquired images from a variety of sources, not just from his internet chats with people. He mentioned there is a photo sharing site out of Russia, which has become known as a bit of a hub for pedophiles to upload and share their photo albums. And Kegan Kline searched that site for CSAN. He also mentioned that Kegan Kline did a lot of internet searches for terms involving kids having sex.
Yeah. A lot of usage of Dropbox, and Commander Cecil was able to explain why Dropbox might be popular with child sexual abusers, basically indicating that, he's sharing links. It's a method for people to be able to share files without getting picked up on the internet. And in some instances, though, he's not able to necessarily see everything. Like, you can see a file existed, but you're not necessarily going to see everything associated with it. It basically, when they're digging through these phones, they're not always able to get absolutely everything that would paint a full picture of what was happening, but they can see enough to possibly result in charges in some cases. So I think it's really important to establish there's a difference between, seeing all the smoke and then seeing the fire. There might be more smoke than fire, but I don't know. This metaphor is really burning down, so let's move on.
I think that about wraps up the initial direct testimony of Commander Cecil, and then it was time for the cross-examination.
We are so delighted to work with our sponsor, Brilliant Earth. This is a company that offers some of the most brilliant and romantic engagement rings and wedding bands out there, all the while ensuring a commitment to ethical sourcing and sustainability.
If you're looking to get married or to become engaged, or even if you're just searching for a special piece of fine jewelry, you have to check out their website. They make browsing so easy.
They even let you design your own perfect engagement ring. Or you can shop by style. I love the delicate willow rings, along with the 3-stone Nadia rings and the classic freesia rings. It's so hard to choose.
And you don't have to worry about the ethical implications of your purchase. Your special gift, your engagement ring, your wedding band should never be tarnished by the idea that the gems or materials came from an abusive system.
See, Brilliant Earth has a commitment to beyond conflict-free diamonds. That means one thing. They only accept diamonds from mining operations in countries that strictly follow international labor, trade, and environmental standards. Fewer than 1% of other diamond suppliers meet Brilliant Earth standards.
You can feel good about your purchase, knowing that you're supporting a brand that actually cares about its ethical impact and is committed to fostering better standards in the jewelry business.
Check out all of their beautiful pieces at brilliantearth.com. That's brilliantearth.com. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit for a reason. HelloFresh really wants you to have it all. Free time and fresh, tasty food. That's why they take care of all the meal planning and deliver the ingredients so everything you need to whip up a delicious meal arrives right to your door. We love the convenience of getting high-quality, pre-measured ingredients shipped right to our door so we can have the fun of cooking meals together in the kitchen without the pressure of worrying about whether or not we have all the items we need.
And let me stress that when we say high-quality ingredients, we really mean it. The last time I was in the grocery store, some of the produce I saw looked like it had been sitting out for weeks. And that is frustrating because this is the peak time for summer produce. Well, HelloFresh makes sure that their ingredients travel from the farm to your front door in less than 7 days. And when something is that fresh, it simply tastes better.
This is another great reason to try out HelloFresh. And remember, Murder Sheet listeners get a special discount.
Go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet50 and use code MSheet50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet50 and use code MSheet50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Find out why HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. By attorney
Honey Yeager. And he was also, Kegan was also represented by attorney Berkshire, who I don't think spoke at all during this whole thing.
I don't believe so. And this was a difficult client to defend because, as they say, the facts were tough.
Plus, I mean, Andrew Aki had been on this case for years defending Kegan. Kegan dropped him over basically, accusing him of not sharing all the discovery, then kind of went back on that and never mind. But now he has new attorneys who are being dropped into it at the last possible minute. So,
and these defense attorneys, have an obligation to raise whatever they can that they think might help the interests of their client.
Yeah, no matter how bad it looks for their client.
Yeah, no matter how bad things look for their client, they have to try to raise points. And in a cross-examination of this witness, Honey Yeager asked, well, you talk about all this stuff on the phones. Was there any stuff on the phones connected to Tony Kline? And Cecil said there were a few passwords and stuff.
There were a couple of accounts. He was talking about essentially different profiles and how do you identify a phone belongs to somebody. So if you look at my phone, you can go on and perhaps my Instagram is Anya Kane and my Facebook is Anya Kane and my email is Anya Kane. And you can then say, okay, all of this stuff ties back to Anya Kane. So if some bad stuff's on her phone, we have a pretty good case here. So he was indicating the same thing. Most of this is tying to Kegan Kline and Kegan Kline's various aliases, but there are a few devices where Tony's on that as well. But there's a caveat here that Commander Cecil and other prosecution witnesses do bring up, which is that repeatedly in interrogations, Kegan was saying that Tony Kline is not a technologically able man. He's not tech savvy. He does not know how to log into stuff. Basically, I think Cecil indicated that he mostly just uses Craigslist and Facebook. So he's not up on the different apps. And that is actually something that our reporting also confirms. Talking with his coworkers, talking with people who knew him, there was a lot of indications that people do not consider Tony Kline to be a technically adept person when it comes to phone technology.
Another point the defense attorney Honey Yeager raised was he wanted to be made clear that, maybe Kegan talked about giving drugs or money to people in exchange for pictures, but there was no evidence that that actually occurred.
Yes. And before we go on, I do want to flag one thing that might be interesting for folks who are especially interested in the Delphi connection here. And this is something that Cecil was talking about how on, around the time of, his house has just been raided. He's been interviewed. We're talking about February 25th, February 26th. Kegan is looking up things like how to delete Snapchats, how to delete apps. So when we're talking about the obstruction of justice charge, that's what we're talking about. The fact he deleted these apps before turning in his last phone. And he's not just doing that like, well, I'm just going to delete these. I mean, he's trying to make sure he's doing it right.
And this was the phone he would have been using to communicate with Liberty German.
Yep.
Now, before we go to the second witness, I want to take a moment to mention something that perhaps we should have mentioned earlier, which was the morning session was attended by none other than Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter. He sat most of the Indiana State Police people were sitting in the front rows.
Yeah.
Doug Carter sat in the very back of the courtroom, and he was also in plain clothes as if he didn't want to draw undue attention to himself.
I don't think he was trying to make it a media event or speak on it or a press conference. I think this is a case that the Indiana State Police have been working on for a long time, so I can understand that he wanted to possibly see it through in some respects.
And I think it's important to note that the superintendent of the Indiana State Police is a profoundly busy person with many, many demands on his time. And perhaps the most important resource that the superintendent has is his time. And so the fact that he chose to spend several hours this morning at this hearing, I thought was highly relevant.
Telling. And I will say this too. I mean, we've reported in the past that he was in communication with the Miami County Prosecutor's Office and that there were discussions about plea deals with Kegan, and he basically made it known that his opinion was that a plea deal should not be made. And I'm going to tell you, that seems to have been had a strategic payoff in this case, because there was no deal. There didn't need to be a deal. Kegan essentially capitulated.
Exactly. Who was the second witness?
The second witness was actually Detective Dave Vido. So this is an Indiana State Police detective out of the Lafayette Post, and his name is probably sounding pretty familiar to you all. When Kevin and I initially broke the news on the transcripts that represented a August 2020 interview with Kegan Kline, that was with Deputy U.S. Marshal Jeremy Clinton and, of course, ISP's Dave Vido. So some of the police parts that I was reading in that were Dave Vido.
And the examination of Mr. Vido was handled by Courtney Alwine.
Yes. So we find out through this back and forth between Alwine and Vido that he's the lead detective on Kegan Kline's case. He's leading the investigation into Kline.
And so, how did this happen? And he said, well, in April of 2019, I was assigned to a different case, and I became aware of Anthony's shots. I think we know what that different case was. It was the Delphi case, obviously. And then in April of 2020, he was actually assigned to the Kegan Kline case. And it was immediately after that, of course, that he involves Commander Cecil and has him commence the forensic examination of Kegan Kline's phones.
Yeah.
That will, a few months later, lead to the arrest of Kegan Kline.
And that starts, he indicates that process, that handing everything over to Cecil, I believe the day he said was actually specifically April 24th, 2020. So that's just giving you a sense of the timeline here.
And so Courtney Alwine said, well, tell us what happened in 2017. And the defense was like, you've just said he wasn't there in 2017, but Prosecutor Alwine said, well, he wasn't there, but he read all the relevant reports. He talked to the investigators. He's qualified to tell us about 2017.
I want to throw something out there. I feel like it's important to stress because, I mean, Cecil and Vido, they're coming into this later, 2019 and 2020, respectively. And basically 2020 when they really start focusing on Kegan Kline. But I think it's important to note that, they were not doing any of this stuff in 2017. So they're not necessarily going to be able to fill in all the gaps. Kevin and I have a lot of questions about why there was such a delay. And the defense is going to raise that point too. But ultimately, it seems like things proceeded in relatively normal order once they got on board. So I think that's telling in and of itself.
Yes. Vido said he watched an interview with Tony Kline that was done, I believe, on the day of the raid. In this interview, Tony said that Kegan Kline had set up all of his accounts because Tony wasn't good with social media. Kegan Kline was also interviewed. He denied involvement in any CSAM sort of thing. He was told, well, it was either you or your father. And at that point, Kegan admitted that it was him. And he said at that point that his father would not know about social media. He had another conversation, Kegan Kline did, before he took a polygraph. And at this point, he admitted that he had gotten some pictures from underage girls and some videos of underage girls and admitted that he had masturbated to them. So Cecil does the forensic examination of these phones and devices years later. They decide there's probable cause to arrest this man. And then they have a bit of a problem because Kegan Kline was not easy to find. If you looked at his social media, it was full of wild tales about him being on tour all over the country.
He's going on tour and he's at blackjack school. Which, no. And also, if you want more information on that, listen to our Vegas Dreams episode because we basically debunk all of his job claims.
And then when they finally did locate him, it turned out he was living in an apartment that was not rented under his name. It was rented under the name of his girlfriend.
So they arrest him at his girlfriend's place.
And then, as you know, they take him to the state police post and conduct an interview with him. That's the interview that we published about a year and a half ago. Some of the memorable items from that talk, of course, where he claimed that his father did not know about his CSAM materials. And Courtney Alwine said, well, most people would not want their dads to see their child pornography collections. Then after the interview, Trooper Harshman takes Kegan Kline to jail. And what happens then?
Kegan makes a comment that he and his girlfriend are thinking about moving to Thailand, which Trooper Harshman thought was peculiar, and Dave Vido noted it is well known for its issue with child prostitution. So it seemed like an odd comment to make when you're the subject of a CSAM investigation.
Prosecutor Alwine asked Vido about the interview Kegan Kline did with Barb McDonald, the reporter from Headline News. She said, how did this interview come to happen? And basically, it was pretty easy. She just went through proper channels on the website and requested it, and it was approved.
Yeah, she asked Kegan for the interview, and he granted it.
They talked a little bit about the content of the interview, how Kegan Kline told Barbara McDonald that he had indeed made the Anthony Shots profile. He said he did it because he was lonely. And we get a lot of this from Kegan Kline. We get a lot of self-pity.
I'm not attracted to kids. I'm just lonely. But I think we can all agree, and I think one of the things raised at this hearing and that we've thought about ourselves is that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because typically people who are attracted to adults are lonely for other adults. And I'm not trying to say anything untoward, but like there's pornography of adults who are consenting out there that a man in search of that can pretty easily find on the internet. So I think everybody's having a hard time jumping from the loneliness to CSAM, stepping stones, because there's a lot of lonely people out there, but most of them don't have a lot of CSAM on their phones, and they're not trying to solicit CSAM from underage girls. That doesn't seem like an excuse that makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
It's more like someone might have a problem with attraction to minors and maybe needs to deal with that rather than just blaming loneliness, even though loneliness sounds like a sadder, more afflicted thing. I can understand how somebody who's attracted to minors would feel lonely because basically the rest of society is rightfully, absolutely reviles what they're into sexually, as they should. But, that's a problem that people should take care of before they're victimizing children.
Exactly. Vido was also asked about his investigation of Kegan Kline, and he mentioned that he had interviewed Kline's family about Kegan. And some of the takeaways he got was that Kegan did not have a normal father-son relationship with his father. It was more like they were best friends. And he also mentioned there was a lot of domestic violence in the home when Kegan Kline was growing up, but Kegan Kline was not the target of that violence.
And that's something we've heard from a lot of people, too, that Kegan was not the one being hit. His stepkids, Tony Kline's stepkids, were the ones he was beating on. And his wife, Kegan's mother, was the one he's beating on, not Kegan himself. Kegan's like the golden child who's actually being essentially protected. That being said, being in such a chaotic environment, I think we can agree that even if you're not the one getting hit, that's going to be incredibly problematic for your development. So we're not trying to minimize that. We are trying to indicate that is, serious in and of itself, but he's not the one directly being targeted.
Vido also talked to friends of Kegan Kline's, and they told him that Kegan had a reputation for years of always trying to get nude pictures of females.
Actually, Courtney Alwine put it in a relatively pithy way when she said he'd just drop in your DMs and ask for nudes. And Vido said something like, yes, ma'am. Like, basically, that's his MO. That's what he does. And it's like to the point where people know. And also, Vido pointed out that people who knew Kegan or were friendly with him, when they saw all his stuff about being in blackjack school and going on tour, they were like, no, he's probably in his dad's house, hunkered down. This is all nonsense. He allegedly had some job. We've heard this before, doing like graphic design on Fiverr.
Vido also said that Kegan Kline had what he called like an incredible reach in order to find these girls who would talk to him. And it was very difficult, but they managed to actually identify 11 of the people he talked to, 11 of the girls he talked to, 11 of his victims. And he said that the majority of these victims were actually what Vido described as locals, people who were within a day's drive of Kegan Kline.
He also noted another disturbing trend when it came to these victims, about what sort of information Kegan seemed to want from them. And that was locations, addresses, and geographic information that could be used for an in-person meetup. And that was what we were made to understand happened to 8 of the 11.
Yes, apparently Kegan Kline tried to meet up with 8 of the 11 identified victims.
Well, here's where I think we need to raise the defense's point. The defense is saying there's no evidence that he actually tried to meet up with any of them. He may have asked for this information, but he's not doing anything with it. So that's something to note. There's no evidence that he's actually taking that information and acting upon it.
But the obvious question is, why would he repeatedly be trying to get information from 8 different girls about their locations unless he had some use for it?
It's a very salient question, because I can understand that he's a person, maybe his MO is not to meet up anyone. Maybe this is all non-contact sexual offenses. Fine. Why are you asking then? Why are you soliciting that information? And what do you plan to do with it when you get it? Yeah, that's a very, that was a point in the hearing when I was just like, I think I looked at you like, oh my goodness, you know?
Yeah, that was very upsetting.
Yeah.
He also echoed a theme that we'd heard from Commander Cecil about some of the manipulative tactics Kegan would use to try to trick or persuade these girls to send him pictures. He would threaten self-harm, suicide. He said he was using heroin. He had brain tumors. He would just really go all out with these poor girls in order to get what he wanted.
And I should add that, we talked about Emily Ann, but there were two other accounts that came up. One was Anthony Schatz. We've all heard of that in connection with the Delphi case. Anthony Schatz, the manipulation comes in of like, I'm a teenager too. I'm an attractive teenager and I'm interested in you and I'm really wealthy, well-traveled, and I'm a great catch and I'm going to take care of you, sort of like a sugar daddy situation, even though I'm allegedly another teenager. And basically that's the kind of Emily Ann was more of the kind of covert manipulation of someone being really depressed and needy. Anthony Schatz is more of the confidence. And there was another one like Trey Lauren, who was designed to look like an African-American man who the detectives indicated that they weren't able to actually retrieve that much information for that one. So we don't actually know the extent of what he was doing on there.
And now we've been talking a lot about some of his personas, and now let's talk about one of his victims. And this is some of the details of this person who they identified as victim number one are haunting to me.
Yeah, this is before we start talking about this, like, consider jumping ahead like 5 minutes or something, because this was upsetting. I mean, just emotionally upsetting.
Victim number one was a girl who was 13 years old at the time Kegan Kline contacted her. And her mother at the time was sick. And she was so sick that she was in the hospital. And Kegan Kline persuaded this 13-year-old girl whose mother was hospitalized to take pictures of herself for him. And she actually ended up taking these pictures in a hospital bathroom.
Just let that sink in for a minute, how just absolutely horrible and despicable that is to be a kid. This is a kid in a really vulnerable emotional state, and someone's paying attention to her and she thinks she's made a friend or a potential romantic partner, and it's an adult man who's manipulating her into doing this while her mother is sick in the hospital. And
it's going to get worse. And again, you might want to consider at least skipping this part. This victim number one said that Emily Ann, Kegan Kline, requested that they meet in a hotel for sex, and he sent her a video of a 2-year-old child playing with the penis of an adult male. And that was very upsetting to victim number one, and she said it's still something that's traumatic and upsetting to her, understandably.
Another thing that's important to note about victim number one is that all these years later, she did not know she was not talking to another preteen girl until Detective Vido actually came and eventually interviewed her. And she that's just to have to break that kind of news to somebody. This was actually a predator. Not a disturbed girl your own age, but a predator.
Yeah, it's horrifying.
He actually sent her lewd images of herself, that's all I'll say, that she had sent to him. And she immediately is like, I trusted you. Why did you save this? And he's, twists it right back on her. Oh, like, I love you, da-da-da. I'd never share it with anyone else. Don't worry. I'm the only one who's going to see it. Of course, this is a theme that pops up with him a lot, promising confidentiality and saying that he's the only one who's going to see stuff. And of course, that's never true.
Vido also discussed, of course, I think we all remember that when Kegan Kline was arrested, he was living in an apartment with his girlfriend. And his girlfriend, didn't know everything there was to know about Kegan Kline. She did agree, and she handed over her phone for a forensic examination. And they found a text exchange there where Kegan was telling his girlfriend about a rather explicit dream he claimed to have had about him having sex with her when she was 12. Like a fantasy he had about having sexual relations with a preteen version of his girlfriend. He indicated that that dream really, really turned him on.
And prompted him to ejaculate everywhere.
There was also, as it happens, a jail phone call between his girlfriend and Kegan Kline. And
after his arrest, right?
This is after his arrest, about a month after his arrest. And as we all know, these jail phone calls are recorded. There's actually even a little recording at the top of every jail phone call saying, hey, this call is being recorded. And in this phone call, keep in mind, Kegan's girlfriend had no idea about the child sexual abuse stuff.
She's a victim in this too.
She told him in this phone call that she had stumbled across a Snapchat account Kegan had that she didn't know about before. And in there, she found that there was a number of conversations Kegan was having with 12 and 13-year-olds, and also pictures of penises, which were not his. She was extremely upset and said that she didn't realize that her boyfriend was a pedophile, and he swore at her and hung up, I believe.
And let's remember, she cooperated with this police investigation. She actually talked to us about her experiences with Kegan. So, let's not blame people close to the perpetrator in this case, because they did what they needed to do, and we just hope that she's healing. If you want to listen to that episode, I think it's called like Kegan's Girlfriend or something. Yeah. It's just kind of highlights the wreckage that these kinds of situations leave in their wake. Vido mentioned another victim who had a memory that I think a number of people, including Anya and myself, are going to find very intriguing. This particular victim says she recalls a video call she had with Kegan in which there were multiple males standing behind him, and Kegan was asking if this girl was interested in a gangbang. The obvious question is, who are these other males? Who are these other males? What is going on? What instance would a group of guys be standing around doing something like that with an underage girl? That's just utterly bizarre and just disturbing. It's one of those details where I'm like, is that like, could he have engineered that in a way like where it's not what it looks like?
Obviously, the answer is yes. Kegan Kline is very good at creating images and such.
Oh, God.
Was there anything you wanted to say about the conclusion of the direct examination or the cross?
I don't think so. I think we pretty much covered it. I would be curious, they did Vido talk about the chirps, or did we get into that later?
He talked about the chirps a little bit, but we get much more into that.
We're going to get much more into that later, but I definitely want to get more into that. And of course, we may miss things in this kind of initial read through, and we can go back and really discuss them more at a later time. We're just trying to give you a flavor of it. And
Anya and I both have, I think, 30 or 40 pages of notes.
Yes, it's actually insane. How did you make of Vido's manner when he was as a witness?
I think Dave Vido, again, was an incredible witness.
What made him incredible?
He was very knowledgeable. He had all this information at his fingertips, and he had just the right amount of disgust or horror at some of these things that Kegan had done.
He seemed very compassionate of the victims and talked about, kind of talking with them and interviewing them. And I really commend him on a job well done investigating this case. I'm going to say this. Something went wrong. The fact that Kegan Kline was not charged in 2017. But that does not fall on Dave Vido, because basically it seems like the minute he got involved with this, things actually started rolling the way they should.
Exactly.
So
actually, before we move on, that brings up a point in cross-examination. Dave Vido was asked by defense attorney Honey Yeager, do you believe that Kegan Kline was arrestable in February of 2017? And Vido said, yes, I believe Kegan Kline was arrestable in 2017. So again, that raises the obvious question: why wasn't he arrested in 2017?
And so Dave Vido stepped down, and
we had lunch.
Then we had lunch. Tim, all this awful, disgusting stuff. Let's all go get lunch. Tim Spahr gave us lunch, and he didn't give us lunch. I mean, like, he took a break for lunch and we all left. And we came back about a little bit over like an hour later, I think.
Yeah.
And we got into the final witness for the prosecution.
This witness was a woman named Cathy Knight, who's the probation officer of Miami County. If you've grown up in the Midwest, as I have, I think you've encountered a number of people, both male and female, who just radiate some sense of decency and niceness. Like, if you skin your knee or something, this is somebody you can go to help you. And this Cathy Knight, just for some reason, just seemed to me like one of these decent type of really nice, sweet people.
Yeah.
And she was absolutely quietly devastating of Kegan Kline.
This was perhaps, I mean, I'm not underplaying the detectives here. It's just like, as you said, quietly devastating. The probation officer is the one who's truly looking at this from the perspective of how can we help this person be rehabilitated and introduced back into society. But they're looking at it hard. They're also looking, what are the risks? And she had some concerns. Yeah.
Prosecutor Courtney Alwine led the examination of Cathy Knight. They began by talking about the pre-sentence reports. I think we've alluded to this earlier. This is the reports that are prepared for a judge about somebody who's been convicted. She said, what were some of the big takeaways from the interviews you did with Kegan Kline while preparing these reports? And some of the things she said was that Kegan Kline came across as being very angry that no women would contact his real dating profile. And so that meant he had to create a fake one in order to get attention. He was upset that he had no job. He had few friends. He felt totally dependent on his father. He was a bit of a shut-in who didn't leave his home very much.
Didn't have a driver's license.
Didn't have a driver's license. He was very lonely. He had some childhood trauma. And he knew that what he was doing with these girls was wrong, but he did it because it made him feel wanted.
He didn't want a relationship with these girls, but he wanted to use them sexually. So it's not really about, that's the thing. I mean, that's what the loneliness, you think you'd want a relationship. Having a relationship with a 14-year-old when you're in your 20s is obviously disgusting and wrong, but it's like kind of also counteracts his loneliness claim because you're just using them for sexual gratification in the moment.
He told her he began looking at porn at the age of 15 or 16, started looking at CSAM allegedly in 2016, although there's evidence he actually began looking at it much earlier than that. He used the Meet Me site where he put up the photo of cop Vince Kowalski to get attention. He claims that he stopped viewing CSAM months before the raid on his home. He deflected responsibility. He tried to deflect responsibility for his crimes on his father.
Here's a direct quote from her. He also said that he had shown his father child pornography as they were sitting on the couch in the living room. So the probation officer took special note of this because when you're having a sexual offender put stuff on other people, whether it's the victims or people in their lives and not taking ownership for doing it, that's a huge red flag.
And it wasn't just his father he was trying to blame things on. There was a female sergeant with the Indiana State Police, and Kegan Kline says, well, this female sergeant told me to go ahead and delete those apps on my phone. And of course, she denies this.
The probation officer actually interviewed her and also kind of noted that, like, based on her level of experience, that's that would be a pretty rookie mistake to have. Hey, yeah, delete all this evidence. Don't worry about it. That would be good for everything. That's not going to happen. That's a pretty unrealistic claim by Kegan and pretty self-serving, She just maintained such a calm, collected manner this whole time as she's taking it through, and you really didn't feel like she was just trying to, throw the book at Kegan. You felt like she was trying to hear him out, but she's seeing red flags and she is calling them out.
Yeah, she's relentlessly, quietly calling them out. She's also mentioning, Kegan Kline's mental health. We may recall that Kegan Kline has claimed that he is both bipolar and schizophrenic. She repeated those claims, but she pointed out that Kegan Kline had never gotten a diagnosis for either of those.
She noted that he seemed to want the judge to see that he is a changed man. He wants to be able to go back to society and show that he can be a new person. And, basically that's a good thing. But at the same time, there's all these red flags where it's like saying things that people want to hear is not the same thing as actually demonstrating the work and the ability to change, the ability to take true ownership for something.
And he again tried to put some blame on his father, talking about his father's violent behavior. He told her the story. I believe he also told us in the interview about his father allegedly cornering him and his siblings with a shotgun. But at the same time, he also said that his father was his best friend.
Yeah, a very complicated relationship there, obviously. And, we will note, I mean, Kegan's half-siblings, Tony's stepchildren, do note that he abused them physically in a very intense manner. So we don't doubt their stories. But that's also a different thing from, all this CSAM. And if you're, he's in the beginning very defensive of his dad. He didn't know anything. He doesn't know how to use technology. And then kind of there seems to be some falling out between them at some point. And then suddenly it's his dad's fault. So, that's something that the probation officer in this case is looking at with, frankly, skepticism.
And I think this is when she's got into the topic you just mentioned about the chirps from
oh my God,
jail. I think we covered some of this on our podcast actually last summer.
Yeah,
where
we're pretty prescient, not to toot our own horn too much, but stick around here, folks. You'll hear what's going on.
This is, you recall that Kegan was having contacts with females who were, we say chirp. Chirp is basically the word used to describe texts sent from prison on this, or jail rather, on this particular system. And women would chirp him because they were interested, to be blunt, in the Delphi case.
Well, let's go before that was happening. Let's start, yes, because that's true, but that wasn't the first wave of chirps.
Talk to us about that.
Okay, so here's what's happening. This was new to us, frankly, and also just disturbing and just like, what's going on? So he's been arrested, but he's not been publicly connected to the Delphi case yet. I believe, I don't want to give an exact date and get it wrong, but that's giving you a general sense. So he's he's chirping with his mom, his mother, and having her look up women for him, including people he was using his abusive CSAM tactics on, Emily Ann, Anthony Schatz, all that. So he's like, his mom, the prosecution says, does not know what's going on. She's a dupe in this. She's not savvy enough to pick up what he's doing. He's just trying to connect with friends, he says. He's not interested in relationships. He just wants to connect with friends. So she's looking up their phone numbers and stuff for him, sending them to him, and he's trying to sext with these people, these women, and he's also getting other names and numbers from his fellow inmates in the Miami County Jail. Why anyone in the Miami County Jail would give him the number of any woman, I don't know, but that's something people apparently felt comfortable doing with. So he's immediately, upon being in jail, doing this stuff again, basically. And there's the defense raised an important delineation that in this round, once he's in jail, he's doing this with adult women. It's technically not a crime because I don't think any images are necessarily trading back and forth.
I don't know if there was any photos, but I remember some of these things were he would ask them to perhaps show body parts during video visits.
Okay, so there's an image component, even if it's not like the traditional, like sending a JPEG. But it's still, I mean, the prosecution's basically saying he hasn't changed. He has not learned that using all these manipulative tactics, and they'll go into that later. So I'll leave it to Courtney Alwine to kind of discuss some of the kind of patterns here later. But this is what he's doing instead of sitting and reflecting on, like, why am I in jail?
And then later, as I was saying prematurely, there was women who would contact him about the Delphi case, women who wanted to get information about the Delphi case, as we all do. And Kegan Kline would use their interest in the case to try to manipulate them, like basically saying, yeah, I'll tell you something about the Delphi case if you do something to gratify me sexually.
Yeah. Tell me about this fantasy or that fantasy, or tell me what you're wearing, that kind of thing. And so, you know, this is, basically the prosecution is using this as like, he's not taking this seriously. He's in fact trying to profit off his notoriety. I don't remember if it was this point or later, but at this point, the prosecution and all the witnesses are another case. We all know it's Delphi, but this all came up in another case. And finally, at one point, Honey Yeager was just like, you know, let's stop. Like, it's the Delphi case, you know? So I think everybody in the audience was like, okay. But basically, this is where we came up, actually.
This is where we came up. When they were talking about the people he'd been texting with, they wouldn't give their full names. They just say he was texting with person A or what have you. And then we came up, they didn't mention us by name. They said Kegan had chirped with two podcasters who wanted to interview him, and he told them that he wanted money from them for the interview. And the hosts declined, and though they didn't say it, that was us.
Yeah, she said those declined to pay him. I was glad she said that, because when she was describing it, I was just like, oh, here we go. Everyone's going to be like, the murder sheets gave him $300,000, you know, because that's how it gets, you know, out on whatever social media platform. But we did decline to pay him, and I'm certainly glad we did. But they basically used that as another instance of him trying to profit off of his connection to the case.
Another example is Barbara McDonald.
Yeah, he accused Barbara McDonald basically when asked about, you know, why he was asking for money from us. He said that Barbara McDonald had promised him money but had never paid him, and apparently, basically, this probation officer said there's no evidence of that. Barbara McDonald is not anywhere in these messages. You know, it doesn't come up in the interview, as you know, if you've seen the transcripts. But not only that, there's no text between him and her saying, oh, yeah, I'm going to pay you $300. I mean, and that's pretty much what we'd expect. That's not what professional journalists do, so we wouldn't expect her to do that.
And it's hard to imagine a way he could have communicated with Barbara McDonald and gotten this promise from her in a way that would not have been seen and recorded in some fashion by jailhouse personnel.
Yeah, she's not sending him smoke signals from outside the Miami County Jail to let him know she's going to give him hundreds of dollars. It's much more likely that he's just not telling the truth about that, and there was no offer of money. But they're just basically going through like it's not enough that he did all these crimes. It's then his behavior afterwards shows no remorse.
And then we do hear a little bit about the one time since he's been incarcerated that Kegan Kline was disciplined. And I'm going to allude to this now, but we'll come back to it later in more detail. And it's an interesting detail that we'll get to later. So put a pin in this. But the one time he was disciplined was September 1st, 2022. The jail took away his communications, his ability to use his chirping device, and he subsequently got caught trying to use another inmate's chirping device, and so he was disciplined. And then we'll get into a bit more detail about that later. Cathy Knight talked about how he always seems to be trying to shift the blame to other people. She said him talking about wanting to be paid for interviews and exploiting the ladies who reached out to him about the case shows about how he basically wants to take advantage of and manipulate others. And she said that she actually had met with Prosecutor Courtney Alwine and viewed all of the materials in this case pertaining to the charges against Kegan Kline. She said she thought that was a very important thing to do. And she talked, and this is a little disturbing, I warn you. She talked about seeing the expressions on the faces of these young kids maybe 3 or 4 years old. The expressions on their faces is they were digitally and vaginally penetrated by adult males. She talked about how blank their expressions were. Her final recommendation was that he be sentenced to 35 years with 3 years of probation.
She described that as conservative, essentially trying to give him the most benefit of the doubt. So the defense raised a big fuss about that, I think. Like, that's conservative, but, I mean, she basically indicated that somebody in this situation where they're not really showing remorse or any sort of improvement sort of maybe actually a problem to have out.
Yes.
In the community.
And on redirect examination with Prosecutor Courtney Alwine, Cathy Knight said that she felt the risk of Kegan Kline reoffending and committing these crimes again is actually quite high. And that was the state's last witness.
Yeah. Again, it's weird that they have witnesses at the sentencing hearing. We've never heard of that before, but that's what happened.
Usually when you have witnesses in a sentencing hearing, it's victim impact statements, basically.
Yeah. But even without victims present in the court, we will hear some statements later. But I think the prosecution absolutely wanted to show the scope and the severity of Kegan Kline's crimes so that it's not just kind of dismissed away as, oh, well, you know, it's just internet stuff or lewd pictures or, you know, wanting to really show what this is, the ugly face of it.
Now, the defense then called their one and only witness, whose identity might be surprising.
Yes. So this is Chief Deputy Dave Vitek of the Miami County Sheriff's Office. So he's a person where we often see him. He seems to be the guy who is responsible for ensuring all of these hearings go off without a hitch. He's coordinating with the deputies in his office and other law enforcement to make sure that Kegan Kline and everybody else who attends these hearings are safe, protected, everything goes smoothly. So, I mean, I imagine this has been quite a stressful time for him.
And that's the reason why he was called, because basically the defense said, hey, to keep Kegan Kline safe in the courthouse, you have to rearrange the schedules of sheriffs and give him overtime. That costs a lot of money, doesn't it? He said, yeah, that costs about $2,000 to $2,500. And so the defense said, well, hey, think how much money Kegan is saving all of us by not having a trial and by pleading guilty. So in other words, the defense is trying to suggest that this is a factor Judge Spahr should take into consideration when sentencing him. Basically, that Kegan Kline is doing the county a favor by sparing them the expense of a trial.
It's a mitigating factor as opposed to an aggravating factor because it's something that the defendant is doing that reflects well on them and maybe means that you can go a little bit easier on them as opposed to an aggravating factor, which means you should go harder on them because they did it in such a way that is terrible. And I mean, Vitek was just kind of like, yeah, that's expensive. But on cross, Courtney Alwine was talking about like, well, we have a budget for trials. So
yeah, what's the big deal?
And Vitek's like, yeah, we do, so it's just, it felt a little bit, honestly, it felt a little bit like kind of like, are we putting a monetary figure on like children being viciously abused? Okay. Interesting tactic, but I understood what they were going for at the same time.
So that was the gist of his testimony, but now I want to jump back.
Not to be clear, I said that that the defense is doing that. Dave Vitek didn't do anything wrong. He's just expressing, because it's his job to know this, all the facts and figures. So I want to clarify. The chief deputy was absolutely fine there and did he did a great job. Did a great job on the stand. So.
Now, I want to jump back to the beginning of his testimony before we leave his testimony, because he said something at the beginning of his testimony that I found extraordinarily interesting and that I have a lot of questions about.
Okay.
He went back to this incident where Kegan Kline was disciplined. Kegan Kline was disciplined because they took his chirping device away from him. So you might be wondering, well, why did they take his chirping device away from him? I think some people assumed it's because he was sending sexually explicit chirps. That was not the case. VTech says they were in the midst of a possible move for safekeeping, and they were told not to have Kegan chirp because that could give away movements and create security issues.
He could chirp someone saying, hey, I'm going out of here to, somewhere else, and then that person spreads it around.
We've heard a lot in the Richard Allen case about whether or not he should be moved for safekeeping issues. So I am curious, why were they considering moving Kegan for safekeeping issues? Where were they considering moving him? Why did they choose not to move him? What was going on there? But
that's a good catch. I didn't even think about that, but that is kind of weird. Did he say when that was happening?
Well, we recall that he was disciplined according to Miss Knight on September 1st, 2022.
All right. So, yeah.
So around that time, they were considering moving him for safekeeping issues. And they told him not to chirp because it would give away movement. So I find this very, very interesting. I'm not aware of any paper trail about this, but who was considering the move? Typically, it would be, I believe, the prisoner who, if he feels threatened, would request a move. Or if the sheriff says, oh, we can't protect this person, they need to move him. Why was it considered? Why did it not happen? I'm very, very curious about what was going on there.
Yet another question raised by all this. And I will say I did think it was pretty on the final kind of redirect situation. Courtney Alwine describing what they would have done for a trial, just said we all would have suited up and done our jobs.
Yes,
she and Jen Keifer have had a lot of great sayings throughout all of this, just like a lot of blunt sayings, just a good tone. I just like that.
They are very, very good
they're
at
really
their
good.
jobs.
Yeah.
Miami County, under prosecutor Jeff Sigovics, they're very blessed to have great prosecutors.
They really are. They have we've seen some really great lawyering recently, but Miami County's, that's a great team.
Yes. I'm not going to name names, but I've seen prosecutors who are extraordinarily bad.
Oh my God, yes. No one we've ever talked about on the program, by the way, is actually somebody we've never talked about on the program. And
hopefully we never will.
Yeah.
But extraordinarily bad lawyering and
yeah. I know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
We're not trying to be caddies. Sorry. This is what happens when we're running around for 12 hours.
But this is an extraordinarily gifted team all around.
Yeah.
I was very, very impressed by Courtney Alwine and Jen Keifer. So that was the end of the witnesses. And now it was time for Kegan Kline to make his statement. Do you want to discuss this?
Absolutely. This is essentially his chance. I'll say this. We saw him walk in with a piece of paper that he had, that had writing on it. And essentially, we kind of had a feeling, okay, he's going to get the chance to have his own statement. And, this is his chance to apologize to the victims, to apologize to everybody that he's hurt with his behavior. He's confessed to the crimes. He's being convicted. He's been convicted for the crimes. He's pled guilty. And so there's no question about did he or did he not do it? It's all about where do we go from here? So he talked about how he was in a deep state of depression when he started this foray into child sexual abuse materials, and that he was a shut-in. He was dependent on his father. He also
the same sort of things that he told Cathy Knight.
The same sort of things he told Cathy Knight. Now, here's a bombshell, and I just don't know how much weight to put on this at this point. I don't want to necessarily discard it or disregard it. I also don't necessarily want, given the context and given who it's coming from, I don't want to necessarily just jump to conclusions that it's definitely true. So I think like we're trying to be open-minded here, but not naive. He said that between the ages of 9 to the age of 13, he was molested by a close family member. And later on, one of the defense attorneys, Honey Yeager, indicated that was a cousin.
Yes.
So we don't know who the identity of that alleged molester was. All we know that Kegan is making this claim. I will say that in the past, he's kind of dropped bombshell claims regarding his behavior. Notably the fact that he claimed to have been schizophrenic and bipolar in the past, which of course Miss Knight kind of threw some cold water on. But
he got very emotional.
He got immediately very emotional and started crying, to the point where it was a bit hard to make out some of his words because he was crying so hard. So he definitely had an emotional reaction there, one way or another, and that is worth saying. And he indicated that he was not stating these things. He was not telling you all that. He said, I tell you all this not as an excuse for my actions. He's just trying to maybe contextualize them, and indicated that he's reflected on his choices. He wishes, according to him, that he had moved out, dealt with his childhood trauma instead of clinging to the past. And he felt like he couldn't get any women. He wanted attention. He wanted to feel wanted. And, he wanted to have those experiences. And so he said, I take full responsibility for my actions. He apologized to his victims. He apologized to Vincent Kowalski, who of course is the Alaska law enforcement officer whose photos Kegan stole in order to make the Anthony Shots account. We're going to hear more from him later, but basically indicated that he felt he ruined his life. And he kind of just he ended it by apologizing to his family. So that is sort of the most we've really heard from Kegan Kline in court. He was crying for most of this statement, very emotional, and had his opportunity to speak to these issues.
And then it was time for Prosecutor Courtney Alwine to get up and give her argument, in which she would explain the sentence that she felt that Kegan Kline should receive and why. And this is such a long day. You always run the risk of losing your audience. And I think she began this argument in such a compelling and striking way. And also in a way, maybe some of you want to fast forward and skip past this. But
yeah, maybe like 2 minutes.
She stood up and she said, high school gangbang, teen fucked for drugs, 12-year-old fingered, and then a few other things of that ilk. And she said, these are just a few of the many search terms that Kegan Kline used on the internet. And this is who we are talking about. And that...
everybody woke up.
That was very...
or at least I did.
That was very jarring. And it also gives you, I think, an understanding of... when we talk about prosecutors, what we want to see in a prosecutor is we want to see a very eloquent and controlled anger. And Courtney Alwine certainly brought that to the table today.
At least in a case that's so serious.
Yes. She used anger as an instrument, and it was quite a performance.
Yeah, it was incredible. I was pretty this was a very impressive, essentially, statement by Courtney Alwine. She basically took us through the case, the heinousness of the crimes, the relevant interpretations of the law, and how a judge might interpret different kind of very technical mechanisms that would determine whether sentences run concurrent or consecutive, or what's counted as one criminal episode versus multiple criminal episodes. So she's kind of speaking to a lot of different important things, and I found it an incredibly powerful conclusion.
And she would switch. Sometimes she would just be very cold and remorseless, and other times she would raise her voice in an obvious anger about how he maintained desperate control over her, and there would be anger in her voice. She said one victim said, "I now live with the consequences of his actions to this day, as I fear all men are just like him." And she raised her voice at the end.
And she's like looking at Kegan at points. Often when she's kind of having these big wham moments of like just saying these things that are really grabbing and kind of dramatic, and she's looking right at him. He's dabbing his eyes with a tissue. He's not returning eye contact.
He is not looking at her at all.
No.
She is saying awful things about this man.
And true things. I mean, things that he confessed to. She's not just, kind of ripping him for everything. She's talking about his crimes, and he is
she is looking right at him, and she does it. She's
powerful.
Staring right at him, and he is not looking at her.
It was really, really
very
powerful.
memorable.
Yeah. And she talked about these victims, she's citing victim impact statements. In particular, victim 1, Vincent Kowalski, and victim 2, I believe.
And I believe
2 unnamed victims, and then Vincent Kowalski.
Vincent Kowalski's impact statement had an impact on you.
Yes. So this is the Alaska law enforcement officer who essentially had his photos stolen. He was a teenager when he took those photos. He was a teenage boy, and Kegan found those. He appropriated them to do this horrible thing. And this man stated in his statement, like, I am not the victim here. I had a bad experience, but like, I am not claiming anything over these girls. But this man had his life turned upside down by this situation, because suddenly, without any forewarning, he says, his face is everywhere, connected to a brutal double homicide of 2 girls. And in addition to that, child sexual abuse materials. And he's all over there for that. His family is blindsided. His wife is blindsided. He's blindsided. And he's got to reckon with the fact that through no fault of his own, a child predator used his face to lure in underage girls so he could manipulate and exploit and abuse them. And when we think about that, that's an incredibly heavy situation to deal with for anybody. And this is a guy who's actually in law enforcement. He's out there to help people and try to put away bad guys. And he's found out that he's, again, through no fault of his own, at the center of this awful, disgusting story. And he's just having to reckon with that. But the part of his letter that got me was there were a couple of things. Talking about a full-grown man used my teenage face to lure these girls. Talks about men do not do these types of things to women and children. He doesn't even call Kegan a man. He doesn't even use Kegan's name. He refers to him once as Kegan and a man, and then he's just like this human being. He's in a rural fishing community in Alaska. There's no escaping this. Everybody's going up to, why are you in this? Why is your face all over this? He can't get away from it. And essentially just was kind of ended on a note of, I'm sorry he used my face to get to these girls, and talking about he is so sorry that this happened to them. And the experience of getting chased down by TMZ and different news outlets, and having people be reaching out to his wife to try to get to him, is so minimal compared to what these girls went through. He got caught in the crossfire, but they were the direct targets. And just that he lives with this guilt that he played any sort of part in that. And he ended basically by praying for Kegan that maybe he can find God in prison and try to be better and just try to live with the weight of his sins. And he actually cited directly from the prayer of Saint Michael the Archangel, which I will read. By the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. So, yeah, that was I got goosebumps when they cited that. He didn't say the whole prayer, but he cited it directly, and it was chilling. And it just, this is a guy who didn't do anything wrong. He just posted pictures of himself as a teenager, and like, imagine that. Like, I mean, I don't know. My heart goes out to him. And Courtney Alwine also got into the victims who provided statements. One of them said, basically, this person made my trauma worse. This was a girl who had gone through so much already. She, in her life, had dealt with domestic violence, other issues. And the fact that this also happened to her just compounded everything in such a way. Kevin mentioned one of these young women, not being able to trust men anymore because this fear that they all could turn out like this. They all could turn out to be doing something monstrous. Just, I don't know. It just makes me so sad for these girls, and this shouldn't have happened to them, and just like the shame and embarrassment and disgust and horror they were made to feel by this situation and realizing what had happened. And like the fact that Detective Vido had to be the one to break it to one of them, that, it's just, I don't know. I really wish them the best in like healing in life. I know they're probably not listening to this, but like, anybody who goes through something like this, I hope they're okay. I hope they can heal.
Courtney Alwine went on to make some other good points. She had a sentence that I thought was really, really memorable. She said, the nature of these offenses is that they occurred in dark rooms. And so that makes what people like Kegan Kline do very difficult to investigate. And she brought up how in 2020, at the time of his arrest, Kegan Kline said that the 2017 raid on his house had changed him. It had been kind of a wake-up call. And because of that, he had stopped looking at and using child sexual abuse materials. But as it turned out, at the time of his arrest, on Kegan Kline's phone that he had at that time, there were two very graphic videos of young children being sexually abused on his device. And she also said, since he's been in custody, he's been doing basically the same thing with adult women that he used to do with kids. And she said, maybe having topless pictures of 14-year-old girls is grotesque, but these videos, they are irredeemable. And we've described some of the videos in this episode earlier.
She noted about his manipulation tactics. He will even manipulate his own mother as a means to an end. When talking about...
She raised her voice when she said that.
Oh, yeah. When talking to the judge directly, Judge Kegan Kline is a master manipulator. Do not allow him to manipulate you like he has manipulated so many others. Speaking of the awful videos that he had on his phones. And I think that is very much worth noting that like he had this stuff on his phone in 2020 when he got arrested. There was substantially less of it on his phone than in 2017, but it wasn't gone. Like that's, like worth pointing out. I didn't know that going into this.
I did not either.
She notes to the judge, though, just talking about when it came time for Judge Spahr to look at some of this materials. And like, let's, I mean, like we've watched Judge Spahr for a long time. He's a very genial man. He's a very chipper man. Like he's just like seems like a very sunny personality oftentimes in court. He's very patient with people. He's very patient with the defendants. He explains things and seems to have a lot of empathy for different people and just seems kind of like one of those very happy, unflappable people. And when he came back from looking at this stuff, he looked different and like not himself. We don't know him personally, but I'm just talking about like we've gotten to observe his style. And I think it's not overstating it to say that there was a definite shift that day. And she noted basically like this stuff changes you. Seeing this stuff, being the investigators or the attorneys or the judge or the probation officer who has to see this stuff, it doesn't leave you. It's the worst thing you're going to see in your life, potentially. And she even said that he came back ashen-faced that day.
And then it was time for the defense to do their best to make a case. Oh, before you move on to the defense, Prosecutor Alwine asked for a 50-year sentence for Kegan.
Yeah, she said 50, but she basically said, you know what, if you can go higher, according to the law, do it. Do higher than 50. She said, we broke it down as best we could. We wanted to comply with the law. We're not asking you to max out every single sentence because we don't feel like that would necessarily be in compliance with the law. And keep in mind, folks, I mean, this is a situation, I do want to say this. A lot of you are probably thinking, well, perhaps if you're doing this to kids, you should just be in jail for the rest of your life, if that. And to that I say, like, emotionally, I agree with you. This is, I think, some of the worst things you could do, and it's to the most vulnerable kids in society, and it's just disgusting. But our laws are our laws, and you cannot have prosecutors or judges just go rogue and say, you know what? I'm going to do whatever I want, because guess what? That's how you get stuff thrown out on appeal, and it just chaos. You can't do that. They have to work with the parameters that the legislatures give them. So in this case, there's guidelines, there's situations where they have to really think about it logically and from a legal perspective. It's not just emotional. But Alwine and Keifer, they've looked at this through every lens. They're trying to figure out what a sentence is that they would want. They say 50 years, but they're very blunt about saying, if you can justify more, then that's what we think would be best for the community we're representing, which is Miami County. And not just Miami County, but all of the communities around the country where there could be kids who could fall prey to this person at a later date.
So then it was time for the defense to try to make a case, and defense attorney Honeyegger tried to identify what he would consider to be mitigating factors that Judge Spahr should consider when he's making his sentence determination, factors which might induce him to make a lighter sentence. And he said, hey, Kegan Kline pled guilty with no agreement. That spared the expense of a trial. It spared victims the ordeal of having to come and testify. Kegan Kline was sexually abused as a child. He witnessed all sorts of domestic violence. He left school in 9th grade. So he offered some of those things as possible mitigating factors. And then he said, he raised this one. He went there. He said, if the state police thought Kegan Kline was such a risk, why did they let 3 years pass between the time of the raid and the arrest?
I don't remember if Alwine objected to that or then dealt with it on cross.
She responded to it a minute later. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
But then I thought it was interesting. The defense offered their idea of a good sentence would be 16 years with several years suspended for probation because they thought, he needs to be monitored after he's released. And I thought that was interesting because that's basically conceding that even his defense attorneys view him as a risk to reoffend and think he should be monitored. And then, as you said, then Courtney Alwine responded and responded rather forcefully. She said it doesn't matter that there was a 3-year delay because it was still within the statute of limitations.
So basically, legally, it should have no ramifications that it took a while.
She said, no matter when it happened, if it's within the statute of limitations, it's our duty to bring justice. And it doesn't matter that there was a 3-year delay because he still did it.
And we will note that it's been stated, the state police released a statement to this effect that the moment the Miami County prosecutor's office essentially was informed about this situation, that they were putting together a case.
Yes. And she said there is nothing to feel sorry for in regards to Kegan Kline. And she stared right at him. And then she said, some people cannot be fixed, and Kegan Kline cannot be fixed. And that was the end of her remarks. And at this point, Judge Spahr, I think it was around 4:30 in the afternoon, and Judge Spahr said, basically, I have to go think about all this.
Yeah.
He says, I'm going to need at least half an hour. He was actually gone for about 90 minutes.
Yeah.
Before he came back and delivered his sentence.
I was kind of surprised how long he was gone, because I tend to think like, oh, they've kind of made up their mind because they've considered all the law. They're not just sitting there being like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Oh, I think that makes sense. They're like, they've read about this before, and you'd think they'd come in with something. But I think he probably, given that it's such an unusual sentencing hearing, he probably just wanted to really soak it in what was said so he's not missing anything. And so he's not like, oh, wait, I should have factored that into it. And also, this is a problem for Kevin and I because we're an English major and a history major, respectively, blah. But like, there's a lot of math here. There's a lot of like, should these sentences run concurrently or consecutively? Or like how many, what's the aggregate sentence? And it's a very complex, when you're dealing with 25 charges and then any number of possible criminal episodes of criminal conduct within that, it becomes complicated quickly because you're like, is every text a separate episode? Is every communication with a different child a separate episode? Like, how do we divide this up? And then how do we sentence based on that in a way that is within the context of the law? So all of this must be considered. It's a very complicated situation.
He came back. He spoke about how the videos and pictures were deeply disturbing and abhorrent, and that he felt the chirps that Kegan Kline sent while he was in jail show that he remained fixated on sexual fantasies. And then he issued his sentence, which was kind of complicated because it's about different counts, and he get this for this count. And this.
Us and the reporters behind us, I think we're all desperately trying to do the math and then praying that he was going to just tell us what the sum was at the end.
It boiled down to a sentence of 43 years with 3 years suspended, because Judge Spahr did agree that whenever Kegan Kline re-enters society, he needs to be given some sort of oversight. And
I will say for Judge Spahr, I mean, I don't think we've ever seen a sentencing hearing done by him before, but I mean, this for him, it's not like he was harsh in terms of going like yelling or anything like that, but this was a pretty serious Judge Spahr that we saw in this situation, and kind of just like disgusted, I think, with what he saw, and just talking about how horrific these videos and this conduct and the fact that it's not changing. And that's what we saw with him. And I'm gonna say, like, he did kind of end with a bit of an empathetic note, and basically, saying that, like, I hope that you can use the resources given to you within the Indiana Department of Corrections to perhaps change and become a better person. You don't have to be the same person forever. If you work at it, if you go work at it diligently. That was what he said. He said, I hope, he was talking about like some of Kegan's claims about wanting to change, and he indicated, like, I really hope that wasn't a manipulative tactic when you said that, because that would be good, but you have to do the work. You have to accept that you made choices that put yourself in this position, and it's nobody else's fault. You can have traumatic aspects of your childhood, but that's not okay that you went through that as a child, but it's not okay for you to then inflict further trauma on other children now. Like that's absolutely not acceptable what you've been doing. And so he also noted some technical stuff. Kegan can appeal the sentence. He can say, I shouldn't get 40 years. He can do that. And according to the defense attorneys, he's going to appeal the sentence. He pled guilty. He has no right to appeal his conviction. So it's not a situation where that can be overturned, seemingly.
Exactly.
At least in my understanding.
And that was the end of a long day at court. After the hearing, we went to Prosecutor Alwine and asked her for comment. And should we give her the last word of this episode?
Before we do, let's just say that we are sure you all have a lot of questions. Frankly, so do we. So we're going to try to keep on following up on some of the issues raised here and see if we can get even more information or clarity or answer any questions you have. But of course, as always, let us know if you have questions. We'll try to dig into them. I want to say before we go and I do want to give the last word to Courtney Alwine, but I want to say that she and Jennifer Keifer, the entire Miami County Prosecutor's Office led by Jeff Sinkovich, and the Dave Vitek, who was basically helping to arrange a lot of these hearings that required a lot of security, the deputies we interacted with, the bailiffs we interacted with, and also the other reporters covering this, and Dave Vido,
Commander Cecil,
Christopher, Cecil. I think they should be commended, because I think this was a situation where you had incredibly predatory and tragic behavior going on, and this puts an end to it, and it's an investigation that, it's never a good situation where you have a 29-year-old man getting into such trouble that he's going to prison for a very long time. But at the same time, when the behavior is this bad and could harm more kids, it just, you have to hand it to the people of Miami County who were able to, and outside of Miami County, who were the investigators who helped put this all together. You have to hand it to them for a job well done in this situation. And I feel like even though there was that bizarre gap in time, this has to be looked at as a success story in terms of getting justice for these kids that were preyed upon.
Now let's give the final word to Prosecutor Courtney Alwine.
I have to thank these guys so much. We've had so much help from so many different agencies. And then for Chris Cecil and Dave Vido, to the amount of work that they put in specifically for today's hearing. I mean, this is a team effort. We could not have done this without all of us. It feels good for this to be done. It feels good for us to be able to close this and know that we've done something good here, that we brought justice to a lot of different girls and events. But a lot of people were impacted by Kegan Kline. Today was a big day.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little emotional, which is odd because that's not how we operate, right? But I mean, my daughter is 1, and the thing that I've been thinking about for months and months and months is this is the case that I'll talk to her about one day when I'm talking to her about internet safety. This is the case that I'll go to. And right now we exist in this world where she's tiny. She lives in utopia. She gets what she wants. She's perfect. And one day we have to pull back that veil and we have to protect her. And that is a tough pill to swallow. This case is how to do it. And fighting these kinds of cases with these guys is how we protect as many kids as we can. It's the most important work that we can do.
Yeah.
And I am so grateful to these guys for fighting a good fight. Thank you. And thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening. Hello, Murder Sheet listeners. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end. Just wanted to take a moment as we close out to thank our sponsor, HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. They are #1 for a reason, folks. Kevin and I have been loving the meals we're getting from HelloFresh. We're talking farm fresh produce, protein, all sorts of customizable options to get you exactly what you and your family need. It's very delicious, it's very nutritious, and it's quite affordable. So it ticks off all our boxes. We've been very happy with the service. And, would love for you guys to try it out if you're curious, or if you've tried it out in the past and enjoyed it, get that discount. It's hellofresh.com/msheet16. And then you're going to plug in the code msheet16. You get 16 free meals plus free shipping. You can't beat that. We've really been delighted by it. We work very hard on the podcast. It takes up a lot of time. It's our small business. We really enjoy the work. We enjoy conversing with all of you every week. But at the same time, it's nice for Kevin and I to kind of have something to do outside of office hours, and cooking these meals has been really fun. We're terrible in the kitchen, like disastrous. I mean, like I can tell you horror stories. I probably shouldn't get into it on the podcast, but I mean, some pretty disastrous moments involving our cooking. Nothing life-threatening, but definitely stuff that we tried to be overly ambitious about, and it either went horribly wrong or it ended up costing like way more than it should have because we didn't properly like think about ingredients, and we're not gifted in the realm of the kitchen. But HelloFresh makes us pretend like we are, because everything is so pre-portioned and pre-planned, and the instructions are super clear, so like you're not going to mess it up if you're like us. And if you're good in the kitchen, then it's just less of a hassle, and you get everything that you need. You don't have to run out to the grocery store. So super nice. Try it out. I've really enjoyed the meals that they've sent us so far. I can say that Kevin has too. I highlight that because Kevin is pretty picky when it comes to food. He does not like everything. He has pretty strong specifications and preferences. Very much cares about things like fresh produce and farm produce and things like that. So he's very picky, and I think the fact that he is really enjoying HelloFresh is a testament to the quality here, because he's a stickler for that kind of thing. And so if you are, I think you will enjoy it as well. And again, the URL and promo code that'll get you a sweet discount is hellofresh.com/msheet16. That's MSHEET 16. And use code msheet16. You're going to get 16 free meals plus free shipping. We hope you enjoy it. And again, thank you